We're going to begin our F14 build with the wing assembly. This is by far my favorite portion of the entire build. The wing assembly goes together very quickly and very easily. In just a couple hours, you're going to have this massive 6-foot assembly all ready to go. Before we begin building, I want to go over some of the supplies that we're going to need to build this assembly. You'll see here that I've got some CA glue. CA glue works great for putting wooden components together. You can also use wood glue, but it's going to drastically increase the amount of time it'll take to build this assembly. You can see that I've got some clear tape and I've got some masking tape. I do prefer the Gorilla Tape. It's much more durable than just the standard packing tape. If you're going to use standard packing tape, you'll likely want to double, maybe even triple anytime it calls for a piece of tape. Here I've got collars. You'll notice that I've got some blue Loctite. I would recommend getting some blue Loctite. You don't want these collars coming loose. You're going to need two 60-centimeter extensions along with one Y extension. These are going to be for the aileron servos. You're also going to need two 17-gram servos. For the swing wing mechanism, you're going to need some heavy-duty servos. The specs for these are going to be listed on the website. You're also going to need some zip ties, a glue gun, and you're going to need a small bar of soap. And no, I'm not going to tell you what you're going to use it for. You're just going to have to watch a video and see. We're going to begin by building our wooden swing wing mechanism. You'll notice that if you look at it from the front, it's kind of got an arch shape. It doesn't lay completely flat. We're going to be going over that as the build progresses. It's very important that you've got this slight arch to the assembly. Now, as we look at the assembly, it looks really complicated. We have symbol mapping all over this, but we're going to break this down step by step, and you'll see that this actually goes together very easily. So go ahead and grab all three pieces of wood out of your kit. We're going to be using about 90% of the wood for this assembly right here. Let's get started. Go ahead and remove all the parts from all three of the wooden sheets included in your kit. Once you've got all the parts removed from the kit, go ahead and locate the parts marked CWM1, CWM2, RWM, and LWM. Let's take a look at our symbol mapping. We can see that these are just going to be edge-to-edge fits. We also have these little half-moon cutouts to help us locate the parts. We're going to be bringing these edges together just like this and gluing our assembly together. Once all our edges are lined up, I'm going to take and push the assembly together. I want to make sure I don't have any excessive gaps anywhere the pieces are meeting up. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to run a bead of glue where the two edges come together here on top. Once I've done that, I'm going to hit it with the activator. And we're going to let the glue dry for about 30 seconds or so. Once that's done, I'm going to flip this over and do the same on the other side. I am going to move the assembly around just a little bit, just in case any of that glue decides to seep all the way through. I don't want it to stick to my work surface. Once that's done, I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to run a bead on the other side. If you want to do these one at a time and you want to add glue to the edges and bring them together, that's okay too, but this works just fine. As that's curing, you can go grab the two parts labeled SWR and SWL. What we're going to do is we're going to put a doubler up here on top. And all I'm going to be doing is ensuring that this hole lines up with this hole. You're going to see a small etch line here on top to help you line everything up. Once it's lined up, I'm going to run a bead of glue all the way around, a little bit of glue here. And I'm going to actually hit this part with activator. And I'm going to drop it in place. I'm looking to make sure that this hole is lined up, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Once your doublers have been glued in place, we want to locate the two circles with a small hole in the middle out of the kit. It's real easy to identify these. They're going to fit in on this LWM or the RWM. And I want to make sure that it drops down and these things will rotate freely. I've got a little bit of a burr right here, so using a file, I'm going to file that burr down. I'm also going to file this burr down. Once that's done, I'm going to drop that in there. I can check to make sure that it'll turn without any resistance. Once that's done, I'm going to flip my assembly over. I'm going to line up these two holes. I want to make sure they're right on top of one another. Check my fit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run some CA glue starting at the center. I'm going to spiral my way out. And I'm going to stop about a 1/2 inch from the edge, because when I bring these two pieces together, that glue is going to make its way towards the edge. I want to make sure it doesn't go past the edge. So once I've done that, I'm going to hit the other part with some activator. I'm holding it up so I can see light coming through to ensure I've got both my holes lined up. I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cures. Go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Once that's done, take your bar of soap and run it around the opening here and the opening on the other side. The soap cuts down on friction between our parts. I learned this from a cabinet maker some time ago. This really works great. I'm going to hit it on both sides. Once that's done, we're going to take our right and left swing wing and we're going to do a quick test fit. Now, one thing I want to make sure of is you can see here that RW stands for right wing is on the side RWM for the right wing mechanism. It's very important that these go into the right slots. Once they're glued in place, you cannot undo this. What we're going to do is we're simply going to drop this in and make sure we don't have any resistance. Once that's done, do the same thing on the other side. All right, that looks really good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my assembly over and I'm going to locate the other disc located in our kit that has a hole in it. You'll notice that this one is quite a bit bigger than the one we glued on before. What we're going to do is we're going to add glue starting at the center all the way around, and we're going to work our way outward. Just like before, we're going to stop about a 1/2 inch from the edge of the disc. I'm going to hit this with activator, and I'm going to line up the circles, and I'm going to push straight down. As the glue is curing, I want to move it. I want to make sure that in the event that some of that glue shoots out, I want to make sure it breaks away where my wing assembly can still be moving. Once that's done, go ahead and do the same on the other side. Once that's done, let's go ahead and work on our main wing spar. Go ahead and find the 4 parts labeled MS from your kit. They're going to look like this. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be stacking these together like this, and then we're going to have a piece that goes out on either edge. Before we glue these 2 small pieces on, we're going to be running a metal pin from here to here and from here to here. But before we install the pin, let's go ahead and glue the 2 larger pieces together. You can spray the activator directly on the glue. I usually like spraying it on the part. I've found it works better for myself if I spray the part. It seems like I've got a little bit more time to get the part in place before the glue starts holding things where I can't shift it any longer. While the glue's curing, let's go ahead and cut our pivot pins. I'm going to create 2 pins, each 1 3/8 inches long. The end piece always likes to shoot off. You can see that I've got a piece of foam up on top of the table. I'm sticking the small piece into the foam as I cut. Once you have your pins cut, you'll notice some little slivers of wood, one at the top and one at the bottom. We're going to cut those away. Do the same on the other side. Next, we're going to drop our first pin in place, and I want it flush up here at the top. Once I've done my test fit, I'm going to fill that with CA. Drop my pin in place. Make sure it's pushed all the way down. And I'm going to hit it with activator. While that's curing, I'm going to flip it around and do the same on the other side. Next, we're going to glue our last piece labeled MS in place. And what's more important than anything is that the bottom edge of this is perfectly flat. If for some reason you get this glued together and it's sticking up like that, it's not the end of the world. We're just going to go back with a file and smooth it out. But it always helps to take a little bit of extra time to make sure that it's flush, and then you won't have to go back and fix it. I didn't get that quite covered with glue. Didn't go quite far enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot a little bit of extra glue up underneath here. Now flip it around and do the same on the other side. You'll notice that I'm adding glue to the smaller part. Now that you've got your main spar made, we're going to go ahead and we're going to clean up these edges right here. Sometimes these pieces don't get glued quite on top of one another. So if that's the case, go ahead and take a file and smooth it out. Also make sure that you don't have glue buildup right here. You can file that down, or using a knife you can chip it away. And you'll do the same thing on the other side. I've actually already checked the other side, so we're good to go. Before I do my test fit, I do want to go ahead and hit this underside with soap. All right, once that's done, we're going to test fit our main spar onto our assembly here. We're going to be dropping this center piece right down inside this slot. All right, one side is going in and the other side isn't. It's always a good idea to first clean out these holes. You'll see here that I've got my set of drill bits. I'm going to be using a 5/32 to begin with. That looks good. I'll go ahead and do the other side while I'm at it. Once I've cleaned out both the holes, I'm going to drop this in, and I'm going to drop this right down in the slot here in the middle. Once I get my main spar pushed all the way down, I want to check and make sure that this moves freely. You're going to get a little bit of drag, but not much. There's been a number of builds that I've done where it has been a little bit stiff. If that's the case, I'm going to go back to my drill bit set and I'm going to go up to a 3/16. So if it's snug, just use your 3/16 and you can clean out that hole. I wouldn't go any bigger than 3/16 if you can help it. Sometimes you only have to do one hole and not both. The key here is you want to make sure that these pivot smoothly. It's important to keep these holes as small as possible. The reason being is the pins that pass through these pivot points add a ton of strength to the aircraft. You'll really see the benefit of this when you begin doing high stress maneuvers. The wings will flex slightly, but they're not going to go very far. The bigger the holes, the more flex you will have. So this side is a little bit stiff, so I'm going to open it up just a little bit. I've already installed my 3/16 bit, so I'm going to run that down. Now I'll reinstall my spar. And I'm going to push that down right here. Oh, that's a lot better. Very good. Now that I've got the holes bored out correctly, I'm going to add a little bit more soap. You're going to see a line here and a line here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to coat the wood between those two lines. I'm going to swing this out and I'm going to hit the underside. You'll notice where you add the soap, you'll feel a lot less friction. Once that's done, we're going to add some soap up here. I'm going to line up my edge to this line and I'm going to draw a line up here at the top with my soap. Next, I'm going to line up that edge and I'm going to draw another line. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add soap between these two lines that I made. I'm going to stay in the lines as best I can because when we come over here and we add our spar, I want to make sure I don't have soap in this area. I want to make sure that my glue is able to stick to the wood. Go ahead and do that on the other side as well. Now that we've got our arch formed, go ahead and check your seams. I can see that I've got a little bit of a break right here, and that's okay. I'm going to force it open. I'm going to feed a little bit of glue in there, and we're going to hit that seam again. Go ahead and check your other seams while you're at it. Once that's done, we're going to flip our assembly upside down and we're going to press straight down right here in the middle. What we're going to do is we're going to run a bead of glue from here all the way over to here, and we're going to do that on this side and we're also going to do it on the other side. Once we've added our glue, I'm going to hit it with activator. I'm going to hold this for a full 2 minutes while the glue cures. It's very important that the tab is pushed all the way down in the slot. This will ensure that we have the correct arch shape. Once that's had a chance to cure, I'm going to flip it over and run a bead of glue right along this center tab. You'll see that I'm not extending the glue past the tab that passes through the main plate. We'll let that cure, and then we're going to work our way towards the wingtips. Before we glue any more, there's a couple things that I want to point out. First of all, you'll notice that my pin is hanging over the edge of the table. If you look right here, I've got a gap. I want to close this gap in, and I'm going to have to do that by simply pressing straight down. You'll notice that whenever I press straight down, that the wingtip moves down just slightly. Next, I'm going to shoot a little bit of glue from either side up underneath that gap. You'll notice that I stopped short about 3/16 of an inch. I'm going to press straight down. I want to make sure that that glue doesn't go towards my swing wing mechanism. If it does, I'm simply going to move my wing back and forth as the glue is curing. Once I've got my glue in place, I'm going to hit it with activator from both sides. And I'm going to press down. I don't see any glue making its way over, but I am going to move this just a little bit. It'll be a little stiff at this point, and that's okay. Once this is done, do the same thing on the other side. I want to double check that my pin's hanging off the side of the table. I'm going to press down and make sure that gap is closed. Run a bead of glue up underneath from this side and also from this side. I'm going to press it down, make sure my glue stays in place, and I'll hit it with activator. Make sure and hold that in place for a full 2 minutes while the glue cures. When you're applying downward pressure, it might be necessary to shift your assembly off the table a little bit more to ensure that gap is fully closed. Now that that's done, we're going to add some spars to our swing wings. Let's take a look at our leading edge spar. I'm going to be adding glue here, here, and up here. Do a quick test fit. We're going to bead of glue here, here, and here. Hit it with activator. And I'm going to hold that down. I'll do the same in the back. Actually, here in the back, I'm just going to run a bead of glue here along the bottom. Once that's done, I'm going to run a bead of glue all the way down where the spar meets the plate on both sides. Anytime I'm using CA, I always want to make sure that my wing continues to swing freely. It's real easy to have a small drop of glue drop down and lock the two pieces together. Once that's done, go ahead and repeat this process on the other side. Once that's done, let's go ahead and prep our servos. I'm going to go ahead and drop these little rubber pieces in these 4 holes on the wings of the servo. I'm going to insert these brass liners. Once those are dropped in place from the bottom, once that's done, let's test fit our servo into our wing assembly. Now that we've got our servo prepped, we're going to do our test fit. One thing I want to point out again, I know I did it earlier in the video, it is imperative that you are using the correct servo. As I mentioned before, all the specifications are listed there on the website. So to do a test fit on our servo, I'm going to drop it in from underneath. You'll notice that my gear is close to the spar. I want to make sure that it's oriented correctly. Once we get our test fit, we're going to flip the assembly upside down, and I'm going to run 4 screws in from the bottom. Make sure when running your screws down that you get them snug. It's real easy to strip this out. Looking at the other side, I can just feel the screw coming through with my finger. Once it's snug, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to go ahead and go caddy corner, install the next screw. I can feel the end of the screw coming through the other side. It's snugging up, so I'm going to stop and add the next screw. Once the screws are in place, I'm going to run a bead of glue between the servo and the wooden plate. This is the last thing I want to have happen, is this come loose during flight. So I'm going to go ahead and glue this in place in addition to the screws. Flip it over and do the same on the top. Once this is done, go ahead and hook your servo up to a servo centering tool. We want to make sure that it is in the neutral position. Now that I've got my servo centering tool hooked up, I'm going to switch it over to the neutral position. Now my servo's been centered. I'm going to shift my attention over here to this extension, and this goes together very easily. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the one with this big cross up on top. Located in your kit is this 4-way servo arm. I'm going to take this and I'm going to hammer this down flat. Anything's a hammer. All right, it's flush there on top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to apply CA to the bottom here. Once that's done, I'm going to liberally spray this side and quickly drop this in place, making sure it's lined up exactly. While that's curing, I'm going to add some glue where the servo arm meets the wood, but I'm not going to get any glue here in the center. All right, we'll let that cure for just a minute or two, and once it cures, I'm going to go ahead and drill out the hole closest to the center here. So just like before, I'm using the 7/64 drill bit. Once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and install the servo arm. And you can see I've kind of got it in the center. It's okay if you put it here or if you put it over here. It doesn't have to be really precise. These have a lot of travel in them. Once that's done, go ahead and drop your set screw in. Once that's done, we're going to move over to the vise and we're going to go ahead and create our linkage. To make our swing wing linkage, let's begin with a piece of medium landing gear wire. I'm going to make a mark at 5/8 of an inch. Once I make my mark, I'm going to drop it in my vise, and you'll see that my mark is just below the top of my mark. Once I've got it clamped in place, I'm going to hammer it over 90 degrees. Go ahead and break it loose. And we're going to make a second measurement. Measuring from the outside of my bend, I'm going to make a mark at 6 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to take my mark and I'm going to place it just inside the edge of the jaw here. Clamp it down. I want to make sure that this piece is horizontal with the table. Hammer that to 90 degrees, break it loose, and from the outside of the bend, I'm going to make a mark 9/16 to 5/8 of an inch. Actually, I've got it right there in between. This isn't really critical. Once I got my mark, I'm going to go ahead and cut off the excess. There we go. Let's go do a quick test fit. Now let's go ahead and do a test fit. The longer leg is going to be going through the servo arm. All right, once it's in there, let's go ahead and rotate. We need to make sure that we have free travel between this line and this line. What I'm going to do is I'm going to position the edge right up against this line. And once that's done, I'm going to glue a stop in place right here. If you locate one of the control horns from your kit, go ahead and take a screwdriver and knock out one of the circles. What we're going to do is we're going to glue a circle right here, and when the wing swings open, it's going to hit that and it'll stop it from traveling forward anymore. About time for a new bottle of glue. I'm going to put a little bit of extra glue here on this outside edge. I'm going to make sure that I don't go around the sides. I don't want to accidentally glue my swing wing in place. We'll let that cure for about 30 seconds, and then we're going to test our stop out. Once that's done, let's test our stop. We're not going to worry about a stop in the folded position. That'll be determined by a setting in the controller. Before I install the collars, I'm going to back the screw out just a little bit and put a little bit of Loctite on it. And we're going to start by dropping a collar right here on this pivot pin. I want to make sure that that's not too tight. I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap. Once that's done, we're going to drop a second collar right here on the linkage. Again, I'm going to back that screw out just a little bit, put a little bit of Loctite on it. And I'm pressing up on the linkage from the bottom. I'm going to make sure it's not terribly snug against the wood. Leave a small gap, and I'll tighten my set screw. Let's go ahead and add a little Loctite to the third collar. And we're going to drop this in place here. And if we come in between the plate and the servo arm, we should have plenty of room to tighten it. Once that's done, you're going to flip it over and do the same thing on the opposite side. Let's go ahead and prep our wing. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this trailing edge piece shut. This will be folded open during shipment. Let's go ahead and add a bead of glue and let that cool for just a minute. Next, I'm going to cut these slots out. If we take a look at our symbol mapping, you'll see that we need to remove the foam from this area, and the two out here near the end. Next, I'm going to go down this score with the backside of a razor blade. I'm going to flip my wing over on itself and follow the symbol mapping instructions by adding bevels between the bevel marks. Using the backside of a razor blade, I'm going to run down the hinge line for the aileron, flip it over on itself, and cut a bevel where indicated. Once that's done, I'm going to run a bead of glue along the hinge and wipe it away using some scrap. Once that's done, I'm going to remove paper where indicated. Once we've got our paper removed, let's go ahead and add some shape. For in-depth information on how to add shape to the wing, check out the wing video located in this playlist. Once we've got our shape added, let's go ahead and do a quick test fit onto our swing wing mechanism. Now that we've got our wing prepped, what we're going to do is we're going to drop our wing assembly over these wooden spars. We're going to push them all the way up. When they're in the correct position, if I'm looking straight down, I've got about an 1/8 inch gap between this doubler and the foam. What we'll do is once everything's glued in place, we're going to take and fill that area with glue. So our test fit looks really good. Go ahead and add glue to the following areas. That's what. I'm going to slide my assembly off the edge of the table where I can push straight down and apply pressure while the glue is cooling. Once that's had a chance to cool down, let's run a bead of glue right here between this doubler and the wing. You can see that I stopped short of the edge. I want to make sure that it doesn't drop down there and glue something that shouldn't be glued. I also did the same here. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to be gluing our long wooden wing spar to our short wooden wing spar. Be sure and double check the symbol mapping. Make sure you ensure that you're gluing the correct piece in place. Let's do a quick test fit. Okay, that looks good. You'll notice that the top is not flush to the other piece. Don't worry about this. There may be some variation in the thickness of the foam. It's nothing you need to worry about. Let's go ahead and apply a bead of CA along the face of the short wooden spar. When I glued this in place, I made sure that the tab was lined up here as well as here on the other end. Once that's had a chance to cool, I'm going to run a bead of glue right along the edge. I'm going to hold this in place for a couple minutes while the glue cools. Once that's done, I'm going to continue to follow my symbol mapping and glue the foam spar in place. Once that's done, I'm going to take my next wooden spar and we're going to be following the symbol mapping to make sure that they're in the correct order. And we're going to glue the two wooden spars together just like we did in the front. I want to make sure that this drops down in the slot here and here before adding glue. Following the symbol mapping, let's go ahead and glue the next spar in place. You can see that I wasn't really precise with the positioning. None of this is really critical. Once our spars are glued in place, let's add our 17-gram Flite test servo. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I've got my servo arm positioned correctly according to the knockout. And I'm either going to rotate it forward or backwards. I'm going to drop it down there and I'm going to press my wing flat against the table, and I want to make sure that my servo is mounted flush. When I reach up underneath the bottom edge, or the bottom side of the servo should be flush with the underside of the wing. And I add a bead of glue around my servo and we'll let that cool. I'm going to take a piece of scrap and put it on the bottom and press my servo down. That'll ensure that the servo is flush with the underside of the wing. Once my servo's been glued in place, I'm going to add a 60-centimeter extension and make sure that my wires are connected correctly, and I'm going to tape my connection. We'll just run our wire here behind this spar for the time being. Now that we've got our servo in place, let's go ahead and fold our upper wing skin back. Whenever we fold our upper wing skin back, we need to ensure that we get the upper wing skin glued to this spar and this spar. I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue down the leading edge seam and run a heavy bead of glue here on top. Make sure you've got some extra glue sticks on standby in case you run out. Fold your upper wing skin over. And you can see how I'm using my forearm and my handheld flat to ensure that the upper wing skin is being pressed down against the spars. Hold this for a full 3 minutes while the glue cools. Once that's had a chance to cool down, let's run a bead of glue right here on the leading edge where it meets this round plate. I'll run a bead of glue there, and I'm going to use a piece of scrap and I'm going to push the leading edge down while the glue is cooling. Hold that for a minute or two, and we're going to do the wingtip. To do the wingtip, I'm simply going to run a bead of glue between the upper and lower skin. Once that's done, I'll run a piece of tape, pull it downward, and wrap it around, and then run a second piece and do the same. As that's cooling down, let's flip our assembly upside down. And let's run a quick bead of glue here at the wingtip. We'll stop before we get to the aileron, and we'll add a bead of glue right here. Once that's done, you can go ahead and mirror this process on the other side. Once both the wings are done, we're going to run our wires through this hole right here and add our Y extension. Let's begin by running both of the 60-centimeter wires through. We're going to extend our wings to the out position. We're going to give it just a little bit of slack. Then we're going to run a zip tie through the two holes, and we're going to secure the wires. You can see that I've left a little bit of slack. Do the same thing on the other side. Once that's done, go ahead and trim off the excess. Again, check to make sure you've got a little bit of slack. And once that's done, we're going to add our Y extension. Once our Y extension has been added, we're going to flip the assembly upside down and do a little bit more gluing. There are a couple areas that I like to add a little bit more glue to. Right here, where the wooden plate meets the leading edge of the wing, and I also put a small bead of glue around here and around here. I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now that the wing mechanisms are done, go ahead and build the nose section and the section right behind the nose and canopy. You can also build the battery box at this time. When building the back half of the fuselage assembly, you're going to notice there's a top half and a bottom half. All the top pieces are marked with an A. All the bottom pieces are marked with a B. If you take a look at the formers, when they come out of the packaging, the A is going to be attached to the B. It's best to cut these in half prior to installing the skins. Whether you're building the top half or the bottom half, you're going to find the skin marked with a star. This is going to be the first piece, and then you're going to simply work your way backwards following the symbol mapping. One thing that I find very helpful is that I leave these rectangular cutouts in place fully assembled. Once it's fully assembled, beginning here at the front, I'll remove this section, and this section. By doing it in this order, you have a lot more room to work. Let's go ahead and install our battery box into the back half of our lower fuselage section. To install the battery box, I'm simply going to slide it in from the front, and I'm going to push it in until the former makes contact with this step. Once that's done, I'm going to run a bead of glue right here and do the same thing on the other side. And I'm going to gently press down and squeeze together. I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, I'm going to run a bead of glue anywhere the battery box meets the former. Just shoot a little down. And we'll give this a couple minutes to cool down before moving on. I'm also going to run a quick bead of glue here at the bottom. Then we're going to switch gears and begin working on the nacelle. I'm going to begin by building the right nacelle. You can see that I've got all the parts laid out. If you look over here, I've got parts R1 all the way through R8. One thing to note, just like with all these other builds, is you'll always want to make sure when bringing the parts together that the designations always stay on one side. It's real easy to get one turned around. The parts may go together, but obviously the fit and finish won't be correct. So always double check that you've got markings over on one side. Over here, I've got my formers. You'll notice that they've already been put together. I'm not going to cover the stacking in this section. If you need help with stacking, check out the stack video located in this playlist. You'll also need to get your stringers and your vertical stabilizer spline. We're going to begin building our nacelle with the part labeled R5. You'll notice that it's got a star. It's got a circle, so we know that we're going to be bringing the two edges together. We're going to be peeling all the paper off of this side, but we also have this glue and wrap. This part is a little unusual with the way it goes together. Let's go ahead and begin by removing paper from the side. Once we've got our paper removed, I'm going to begin by adding some shape. Before I get started though, I do want to talk about my work surface. In my other videos, I usually have a hard plastic mat. You'll notice on this build that I've got a piece of foam down. If you don't have a large piece of foam, you can use a piece of cardboard or perhaps some newspaper or something. It's really important to have a softer surface. We're going to be flipping this model over and we're going to be applying downward pressure. If you have a hard mat and you have a piece of glue on it or something like that, you're going to run into denting issues. So I prefer a softer work surface for this particular model. You're going to notice on this build that I've got a series of scores. These scores help us to add shape to the correct place. Even though we could put the model together without adding any shape, I like to add a little bit of shape in addition to the scores. Will help really soften the appearance on the exterior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of shape all the way around here. Here, I'm going to bend this straight over about 90 degrees. I'm going to line up my scores and fold it over. Do the same here. Notice I'm holding my hand flat and also my wrist. I'm adding shape from one point to this side of the score, and I'm also going from this point over to here. There we go. And I also need to form about a 90-degree bend along this double score. Once that's done, I'm going to add a little bit of shape between these sets of scores. All right, once that's done, we're going to go ahead and form up our first stringer. To make a stringer, I'm going to use the back side of my razor blade and I'm going to run it down the score in the middle. I'm going to fold it over on itself. We're going to bead a glue and close it up. I'm going to go ahead and position my first stringer. I'm going to bring it up right along this edge. It's a little bit hard to see, but I've got a star right here. The star is pointing this direction. This is going to help me position this first stringer. I want to make sure that my stringer is flush here in the back, and I want it sticking out past the edge of the skin here on this side. Once we know where we're going to put it, I'm going to run a bead of glue. And we're going to glue our stringer in place. If you've got some excess glue, you can use a piece of scrap to wipe it away. Once the stringer's had a chance to cool down, we're going to glue our RN3 former in place. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be dropping our stringer inside this notch on the former. It's going to fit like this. We're going to be gluing from here over to here. When gluing our formers in place, we want to make sure that one layer of foam is sticking up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this undercut with glue. I'm going to go from this edge of the notch, fill the notch, and come up all the way to this corner. I'm going to carefully drop this in place. I'm going to flip this around so that you can see I've got one layer of foam sticking up. Hold this in place for a full 3 minutes. It's very important that the former does not shift as the glue's cooling down. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, I am going to add another bead where the former and the stringers meet. As a little bit of extra insurance, I'm going to add a bead of glue where the skin, formers, and the string meet. Once that cools down, we're going to do the same thing on the RN4 former. Before we add glue to our RN4 former, I'm going to drop it in place, and you can see we're going to be adding glue from here all the way around the stringer up to this corner. Just like before, I'm going to add glue to 2 of the undercuts. Drop it in place, and I'm going to hold this for a full 3 minutes. Once the glue cools, I'm going to add another bead on the inside. Now that that's had a chance to cool down, using the glue and wrap method, we're going to continue to work our way around. For this next step, we're going to be applying glue to 2 of the layers of foam here and over here, and then we're going to roll this closed and hold it straight down on the tabletop. It's going to be very important whenever you roll this down that you twist the former where one layer of foam is sticking out exactly. So as the glue's cooling, you're going to want to be looking straight down to make sure that the former stays in the correct position. Hold this in place for a full 3 minutes while the glue cools. You'll notice I'm taking a little bit of extra time to ensure that the glue has plenty of time to take hold. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to drop in another stringer. The position of this isn't really critical. I'm simply going to drop this in the slot, and you'll see that it's sticking back about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches. Again, not real critical. What I'm going to do is I'm going to position the end of the stringer right between these 2 scores. Once that's done, I'm going to add a bead of glue here and a bead of glue here in the cutout on the former. I'm going to hold that down until the glue cools. Then we're going to continue wrapping the skin around the formers. Now that the glue's cooled, I'm going to rotate my former down until it makes contact with the skin. I can see that I need to push it over so that I've got one layer of foam sticking out. And my test fit looks good. Like before, I'm going to run 2 beads of glue, one down each of the undercuts on the foam. I'm going to run it all the way up to where the next stringer goes. I'm going to rotate it over. Check to make sure it's twisted okay, and I'm going to hold this in place until the glue cools. I've got firm pressure, but I'm not mashing down on the tabletop. I want to make sure that I don't squeeze that skin that I'm gluing in place. It's a good idea to remove glue between steps. You want to make sure that you don't dent your finished piece. All right, just like we did before, we're going to drop a stringer in. And this time, I'm going to line up to the middle score. You can see that I'm running it past about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches. It's not really critical. Once that's cooled down, I'm going to glue the back of the skin to our former. Since I've got more of a curve, I'm going to press the skin downwards onto the former. Looks like I've got a little bit of excess glue, so I'll wipe that away using some scrap. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to apply glue here and over here. Once we apply our glue, we're going to rotate this over. And you can see I'm running the glue until it hits this radius. Same here, I'm going to run the glue all the way up until that radius starts. And we're going to roll this over. I want to make sure that I have one layer of foam sticking out. And I'll do the same here. Hold that for a full 3 minutes while the glue cools. Once that's been glued in place, I'm going to run a bead of glue along this edge, and I'm going to drop another stringer in place. It's flush at the back, and the stringer goes past this leading edge. We'll let that cool, then we're going to do a quick test fit. Before we do our test fit, I'm going to cut a slide angle here on this first former. This will help the stringer roll into place. When doing our test fit, I'm first going to roll the skin into the place here at the back. You'll notice that the paper is overlapping the paper right here. Now if you look closely, you'll see that I've got a gap. That's okay. I would much rather have a former loose than tight. There's a lot of variation from batch to batch on foam. It may be necessary, if you're having trouble closing this, take a razor blade and remove some of the material around the perimeter of the former. So here at the front, let's take and drop that stringer in, and you can see that I've got a little bit of extra space there too. Again, that's okay. Now that we've got our test fit, I'm going to pop this open, and we're going to apply 2 beads of glue along each of these undercuts. I'm going to run a bead of glue all the way down into this cutout. And since I've got a gap, I'm going to put quite a bit of excess glue in there. Now, when I bring my edges together, it's very important that this corner is even with this corner. It naturally wants to come together stepped like that. So I'm going to add a little bit of a twist. I'm going to drop this in till those corners are even with one another. And I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Since I've got a gap, I am going to try to hold my hand where I've got an even gap all the way around. If there's an area where the glue isn't making contact, that's okay. We'll go back and add some more glue before moving on. Since on this particular build I've got a gap, I'm going to go ahead and shoot a little bit more glue in between the skin and the former. If you've got a little bit thicker run of foam, you may not need to do this step. For this next step, we're going to be adding a very heavy bead of glue all the way down the edge of the skin. When I go and bring these edges together, all that glue is going to come shooting out and it's going to make a real mess. To keep us from making a mess, I'm going to tear off 2 long pieces of masking tape. I'm going to put it right along the edge here, and I'm also going to do one here. Once I've got my tape in place, I'm going to fill this area with glue, and I'm also going to run a bead of glue here. Once I've got my bead of glue added, I'm going to drop that stringer down into the slot. And using a ruler, I'm going to press straight down. I'm going to peel the first piece of tape off. And I'll peel this second piece of tape off. You can see that I don't have glue shooting out all over the place. And then using my ruler, I'm going to press down again. I'm applying most of my pressure directly above the formers. If I press straight down in the middle and I've got a little bit of flex in my ruler, I may create a crinkle there in the middle. This is probably the trickiest part of the build, so take your time, give the glue a full 3 minutes to cool before releasing pressure. So if I look closely, I've got a little bit of a gap right here. I'm going to show you how to fix that. Using a razor blade, let's go ahead and remove these knockouts. Now I could put a bead of glue here on the exterior, but I like to keep my glue hidden whenever possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my assembly over and I'm going to drop a bead of glue down from the inside. Got my glue in place, and I'm going to get my ruler and use it so I'm applying even pressure, and I'm going to bring these two edges together and let that glue cool for a full 2.5 to 3 minutes. You can repeat this process until it stays in place. Looks like I've got a gap. Go ahead and run a bead of glue where the skin meets a former. Using a piece of scrap, you can wipe away any excess. I'm just going to hold it in place where the gap is even all the way around. To ensure the skin stays in place, I'm going to put the end of my glue gun just past the former and drop it down and run a bead where the former meets the skin. We'll let that cool before moving on. Once that's cooled down, let's go ahead and knock out the circles. And go ahead and grab your R6 skin. Let's start by removing paper from the side indicated. Once we've got all our paper removed, let's do a 90-degree bend where we see these 3 scores. Let's also do a 90-degree bend here where we have this single score. And I'm going to add a little bit of shape all the way across here. And I'm going to add a little bit of shape between this set of scores and this set of scores. Just a little. Now I'm going to add shape across these scores. All right, that'll get it. I want to drop a stringer in place along this edge. We're going to cut it to the exact length of the skin. I'm going to run a bead of glue and set it in place. Make sure the edges are even and let that cool for a minute or 2. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to drop the stringer in this notch on the former. We're going to drop it down and check the fit. It looks good. I'm going to apply a heavy bead of glue right along this single layer of foam sticking out, and we're going to drop this in place. Give this a full 3 minutes. Don't get in a hurry. It's very important that everything stays in place before moving on. We're going to add a second bead of glue before we start wrapping. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to be running a bead of glue right along the edge of that former, and we're going to be closing this skin. We're bringing the 2 skins together. The paper on this skin is going to be overlapping this one just slightly. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes and then continue to make my way around. I'm going to go ahead and run a second bead where the skin meets a former. Be sure and give that plenty of time to cool as well. On this next step, we're going to be running a bead of glue from here all the way across the top, all the way down to this corner. Just like before, the paper on this piece is going to be slightly overlapping the paper on this piece. All right, once that's done, I'm going to run a bead of glue from the corner and about 1/3 of the way down the radius. On this next step, we're going to cut another stringer to the same length as the skin. And I'll run a bead of glue across the edge and glue my stringer in place. Once our stringer is glued in place, let's do a quick test fit. Push that stringer down into the slot, and I'm going to bring the skins together where I've got just a slight overlap. That looks good. From the inside, I'm going to run a bead right along the edge of the skin and drop some glue down inside of that knockout on the former. Wipe away that excess, and we're going to drop that stringer in place. I'm checking to make sure that I've got a good paper overlap, and I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Make sure and give that a full 2.5 minutes before moving. Now that that's had a chance to cool, I want to bring this edge and this edge together. I want this paper to shingle over this paper. Once that's been done, I'm going to run a piece of tape right across. Once I have my tape in place, I'm going to run a bead of glue inside of that channel between the two stringers. I'm running a very heavy bead of glue. This is going to take a while to set up. While the glue's cooling, I'm going to take and pinch the stringers together. I want to make sure that my hand is out of the way in case the glue decides to drip down. Before installing our next former, we're going to feed the female end of this 60 centimeter extension through the hole here. And it's going to come out over here on this side. Unfortunately, we're going to have to kind of fight this wire from here on out, but it's a lot easier to install it now rather than later. To test fit our RN5 former, I'm going to drop it down and line up the stringers into this notch, and I want to make sure that my horizontal stabilizer spar passes through the slot in the skin. This fits pretty loose. It might be necessary to take your former and roll it on the tabletop as we've done elsewhere in order for this to fit. But I'm happy with that fit, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this out and I'm going to run a bead of glue all the way around the inside of the skin. I do want to make sure that these two dotted lines are lined up exactly with this knockout. You'll also notice I have one layer of foam sticking up evenly all the way around. To form the spline, I'm simply going to use the back side of my razor blade, and I'm going to go down the score, and I'm going to book fold it on top of itself. Add some glue and bring the two sides together. While that's cooling, using a razor blade, I'm going to connect the dots here up on top. And we're going to pull the scrap out. Once that's done, our block is going to drop in here like so, and it's going to drop straight down in the back. All right, I've got our test fit. Let's drop some glue down here in the former, and I'll do the same thing here at the back. Notice that my large block is towards the front. We'll let that cool. While it's cooling, I'm going to drop a little bit of glue where the spline meets the skin. It doesn't have to be neat, it's all going to be hidden inside, and it doesn't take much to hold it in place. Once that's done, go ahead and grab the skin labeled R7 and remove the paper on the side where it's indicated. We're going to add shape all the way around. Next, we're going to locate the arrow. This tells us where we're going to start the glue and wrap process. And what we're going to do is we're going to match it up to the seam right here. I'm going to apply a bead of glue along the edge of the skin, just past the spar, and I'm also going to add a little bit of glue to the former. Bring my two edges together. The piece that I'm gluing in place is going to shingle over the piece that I'm gluing to. Hold that for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. Before going any further, I want to add a little bit of glue where the former meets the skin. We'll let that cool, then we'll continue to glue our skin to the former. Once that's cooled down, we're simply going to work our way all the way around. Once that's cooled, we're going to continue to make our way around. We're running a bead of glue where the former meets the skin, and I'm going to pull it closed. Once that's done, go ahead and grab the R8 skin, remove the paper. We're going to add shape all the way across. And following our symbol mapping instructions, we're going to install it to the previous skin. Before gluing the skin the rest of the way, I'm going to add a bevel right here along the edge. I'm going to add glue all the way around. Once that's done, I'm going to run a piece of tape across the seam, and I'll run a second piece of tape. I'm going to flip this over and run a bead of glue where the two edges come together. I'm going to press it down on the tabletop. This will prevent an angle being formed by the two edges coming together. Once that's done, we're going to install the EDF assembly. For detailed instructions on how to build the EDF, check out the EDF video located in this playlist. When installing the EDF assembly, you'll notice that we've got a knockout on the RN3 former. We're going to pass the wires from our EDF through this knockout as we slide the assembly into place. Very important that the wires come out this hole. So make sure that as you're pushing the assembly in, it doesn't get twisted too much one way or the other. Okay, I've got access to all three of my wires. Next, I want to run a bead of glue where the thrust tube meets the former. You'll want to make sure that you do not have any glue roll down and get into the fan. Go ahead and let that cool before moving on. Once your EDF is in place, go ahead and grab the skin labeled R4. You're going to need to run a bead of glue over here near the arrow. This will be broken over on itself during shipment. Once that's glued in place, you can remove the paper from the side indicated. Once we have all the paper removed, let's go ahead and add some shape. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a 90-degree bend right where we glued this seam. Let's also do a bend right here along this double score. Add a little bit of shape across the top. Then we're going to add shape all the way down. Once that's done, we're going to begin the glue and wrap process right here. I'm going to begin by adding a bead of glue right here and along this stringer. We're going to hold that in place for a full 3 minutes while the glue cools. Once that's done, we're going to add a little bit of glue here along the former. Next, I'm going to add a bead of glue along these scores. Once I add my bead of glue, I'm going to lift my stringer up. I want to make sure it stays in place. I want it running right along those scores. Next, I want to run a bead of glue where the skin meets the former. Press and hold in place. Next, I'm going to run a bead of glue right underneath this stringer. I want to make sure my stringer is running parallel to the scores. While we're at it, let's go ahead and add a bead of glue where the stringer and the skin comes together. Once that's done, we're going to continue to make our way all the way around. I'm going to add a bead of glue along the former. You'll see that I'm just adding glue along the flat portion of the former. I'm stopping when the radius starts. I'm simply going to continue the rest of the way around. And just like we've done elsewhere, the part that I'm gluing in place is going to be shingling over the part that I'm gluing to. I want to make sure that these edges come together correctly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the two corners together. This paper is slightly overlapping this paper here. Once I've got my edges together, I'm going to run a bead of glue where the two edges come together. I want to make sure this stringer is in place, so I'm going to shoot a little bit of glue there and a little bit of glue here, and I want to push it all the way up into the corner. You can wipe away any excess glue with a piece of scrap. While I'm at it, I'm going to carefully add a bead of glue where the former meets the skin. I want to be very careful that I don't accidentally drip some glue down inside the EDF. Once that's done, let's cut the stringers flush with the edge of the skin. Once that's done, I'm going to drop my RN1 former in place. It's going to fit right here. You'll notice that the RN1 former is sticking out from the edge of the skin. Run a little bit of glue. I'm going to run a bead of glue along the edge of the RN2 former, and we're going to drop this in place. Hold that in place for a full 2.5 minutes. I want to make sure that this is positioned correctly. Once that's had a chance to cool down, locate the skin labeled R3. Let's go ahead and remove the paper. Once the paper's been removed, we're going to add shape where you see the scores. Here in the front, we want to leave this pretty flat. I'm going to add a little bit of shape right up here. I'm going to avoid adding any shape here. All right, once that's done, we're going to bring our part right up and butt it up against this edge. Next, we want to add a bead of glue right here. and hold it in place while the glue cools. Let's also add a bead of glue where the skin meets the former. We're going to let that cool for a couple minutes, then we're going to do the glue and wrap method all the way around. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, let's add glue to the edge and begin working our way around. Go ahead and add a little more glue. Once that's done, go ahead and grab the skin labeled R2 and remove the paper. We're going to add a little bit of shape. Make sure that you only add shape in these areas. You don't want to add any shape right here between the scores. Once that's done, we're going to line up the corners and bring the two edges together. Once the glue cools, you can go ahead and work your way around. I'm going to run glue right along this flat and around the radius, about halfway. Bring my two edges together, and as the glue's cooling, I want to make sure this area stays good and flat. Once that's done, we're going to work on the R1 skin. Let's begin by removing the channels here and here. Next, I'm going to remove paper from here. I am going to leave the paper in place right here. One thing I want to point out, when I bring these two parts together, you're going to see a triple arrowhead here and a triple arrowhead here. Anytime you see this triple arrowhead, things line up a little bit wonky. We're going to be using a reference mark right here and lining it up to this corner. I'm going to flip my assembly over, and I'm going to be lining up this reference mark to the corner. Once that's cooled, I'm going to make a bend right here. I'm going to glue these two edges together. On this next step, we're going to be doing a B-fold. So I'm going to fold this plate down, and I'm going to be bringing these corners together. You want to make sure that these corners are lined up exactly. You can't have it this way or this way. Make sure they line up exactly. I'm going to get a couple pieces of tape on standby, and then we're going to apply a bunch of glue. As the glue's cooling down, I'm going to flip my assembly upside down. We want to look at our intake from the front. You'll notice that it's kind of slanted over. We want to make sure that it's squared up like this. In order to get that shape, I'm going to run a bead of glue here and here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually flex the foam just past where I want it to end up. Once the glue cools off, it'll return to this position. Once that's cooled down, let's shift gears and build the horizontal and vertical stabilizers. Let's begin with the vertical stabilizer. Go down the center score with the back side of my razor blade. We'll flip it over on itself and cut a bevel on either side of the score. Once you've got both your bevels cut, run a heavy bead of glue down the center and run glue on one side or the other. Notice that the glue is about a ½ inch from the edge. Once we bring the two edges together, it'll shoot towards the edges. Make sure when you fold this in half that it lines up exactly. And you're going to press and hold for about 2 minutes while the glue cools. I've designed the F14 to have fixed vertical stabilizers. I did this in order to save weight. Yaw control is done with differential thrust. If you want to do actual rudders, there's some other methods covered in the vertical and horizontal stabilizer videos located in this playlist. If you intend to do the fixed rudders, what we're going to do is we're going to next make a cut between this reference mark and this angle here on the rudder. All right, you can take this piece and discard it. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to do a test fit right here. And we're going to run a bead of glue right where the two halves meet. Bring the two pieces together and hold in place for about 1.5 minutes. Once this is done, let's move on to our horizontal stabilizer. To build the horizontal stabilizer, I'm going to use the back side of my razor blade and go down this score and this score. I'm going to flip it over and run bevels indicated by the symbol mapping. I'm going to run bevels where indicated by the symbol mapping. Next, I'm going to remove the foam here. Need to knock out this section. Next, I'm going to drop my servo in place. You'll notice that I already have my servo arm pointing straight up. And I'm going to drop my servo in place. Once my servo is in place, I can run a little extra glue around it, and then I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue in this area here. I'm going to fold this over on itself. I want to make sure it lines up exactly, and I'm going to hold it down while the glue cools. Make sure that these two openings are lined up to one another. Make sure you run a bead of glue down the elevator hinge and wipe away the excess using a piece of scrap. Once that's done, go ahead and center up your servo using a servo centering tool. We're going to be using the lightweight landing gear wire. Using an X-Acto knife, I'm going to open up the hole just a little bit. Once that's done, I'm going to make a Z-bend. And I'm going to run it through the servo arm. Looking down directly from above, I'm going to create a second Z-bend right at the hinge line. Next, I'm going to cut off my excess about 1/4 inch from the bend. Next, I'm going to run 2 control horns onto the Z-bend. Since this is such a large aircraft and there's going to be so much pressure on this elevator, I'm doubling up the control horns. Next, we're going to glue them together. To glue our 2 control horns together, I'm going to hit one of them with CA, hit it with some activator, and quickly line them up to one another. Once that's done, I'm going to fill this cavity with glue. I'm making sure that my elevator is laying perfectly flat, and I'm going to drop my control horn into the slot. As the glue's cooling, I'm going to run a little bit more glue on either side. If you need more detailed instructions for servo setup, check out the servo video located in this playlist. Once your horizontal stabilizer has been glued together, go ahead and run the horizontal stabilizer spar into the slot. Next, I want to connect our 60 centimeter extension to our servo. Make sure and really tape this connection. I'm going to pull out most of the slack. Next, I'm going to shoot a little bit of glue down into this slot. Usually 2 to 3 shots will do. Next, we're going to slide spar into the slot, and we're going to slide the horizontal stabilizer up against the nacelle. You're going to have to pull the servo wire through as you're pushing the horizontal stabilizer up to the nacelle. If you look up here at the front, you're going to see a reference mark. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the tip of the horizontal stabilizer just below that mark and run a line of glue all the way back. Then I'm going to bring the tip up and line it up with that hole. As the glue's cooling, I'm going to run a second bead of glue all the way back, and I'm going to stop before I get to the elevator. Once the glue cools, we're going to flip it over and run a bead of glue along the bottom side as well. Once you've completed this step, you're all finished with this nacelle. Go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. We're going to drop our wing assembly on top of the back lower portion of our fuselage. You're going to notice that we've got some tabs that'll drop into some slots there on the wing housing. Here at the back, you're going to notice a couple small reference marks. Line up the back of the wood to these reference marks. Once you're happy with the position, go ahead and run a bead of glue right here on top of the tabs. Give this a full 3 minutes to cool down. Then we're going to flip the entire assembly upside down and run a bead where the skin meets the wood. Do the same on the other side. We'll give the glue a couple minutes to cool down before moving on. Next, we're going to cut some of our stringers. You can see from the leading edge, I'm going to cut it off about here. The length isn't real critical. Next, I'm going to cut a piece from the back here, and I'm going to cut it just short of the spar. And then from the spar, I'm going to cut it just short from the back here in the center. Next, I'm going to cut a piece right here. And again, the lengths aren't particularly critical. Once our stringers are cut, I'm going to glue this just inside of this slot. I'll do the same in the back. And for these two, I'm going to glue these just inside our seam. When looking at it from the front, you're going to see that we have created a channel that a single piece of foam fits in. This is going to help us whenever we go to drop our engine nacelle into position. Let's go ahead and do a quick test fit. Before we do our test fit, I need to remove a small amount of material. You're going to see a portion of this former sticking out past the skin. What I'm going to do is, using my razor blade, I'm going to remove anything that's sticking out past the skin. Once I've removed the material, I'm going to flip my assembly upside down. I'm going to gently squeeze right where the two skins come together. I'm going to line the tab in the rear to the slot in the rear, and I'm going to line up the slot and tab up front. I want to make sure the skin of my nacelle is dropping down into that channel we created with the stringers. If we look here at the back, I'm going to make sure that my skin is making contact with this wooden plate. Next, I'm going to gently squeeze the sides until the tabs line up with the slot there in the front, and then I'll do the same thing here in the back. All right, our test fit looks good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the assembly and I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue between the stringers on the inside. We'll come back and put a heavy bead of glue on the outside once everything is glued in the middle. I'm going to temporarily run my wire over here. I want to make sure it doesn't get glued in place. Next, I'm going to run a very heavy bead of glue right here. Also here and right here. Doesn't have to be quite as heavy because we'll have some access from the top. Put a little glue running down there as well. Just like before, I'm going to gently squeeze this, line up my tabs. I'm going to make sure it's shoved all the way forward. Squeeze here, squeeze here. And I need to apply some downward pressure. Now I'm using firm pressure, but I'm not pressing particularly hard. If you press really hard, you're going to cause a crinkle. Hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, I'm going to flip my assembly upside down, and from the top, I'm going to add a really heavy bead of glue between the wood and the tab. Next, I'll do the same thing on the other side. Once these two areas have been glued in place, let's shift our attention to these two tabs. What I need to do is I need to ensure that I don't have a gap right here. These tabs are where they're supposed to be. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab here, and I'm going to grab here, and I'm going to shift everything until the wood makes contact with the skin. Once we apply glue, we're going to want to hold these two pieces together until the glue's had a chance to cool. We'll do the same thing we did before. Just going to run a bead of glue where this tab is coming through the slot and do the same thing over here. I'm also going to run a bead of glue right here, and I'm going to squeeze everything together and hold this in place for a full 3 minutes. I want to make sure that nothing shifts. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, we're going to flip it over and put a bead of glue on the underside where the wood meets the skin. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, do the same thing on the other side. Once your nacelles are in place, go ahead and run your swing wing servos through this pill-shaped slot, and we're going to drop them into our battery box. You'll also want to add two 10mm extensions to the elevator servos. Let's do that now. You can also put 10cm extensions on your swing wing servos as well. Once we've added these extensions, let's install our ESCs. Let's go ahead and hook up the ESCs now. Once you've got all your wires through, go ahead and cinch everything up. Now that we've got our wires tamed, let's go ahead and install some of these wooden cross pieces. Find the wooden cross piece that's labeled WSN1. What we're going to do is we're going to drop this. You'll notice we've got a slot here and we've got a slot here. We're going to take and we're going to drop this in place. I'm going to gently open this up and drop that into the slot. I'm going to apply a bead of glue only along one side. Next, I'm going to grab one of the cross members that's labeled WSN2. I'm going to drop it in the top slots as I'm looking at it from above. Just like before, I'm going to run one bead of glue. We'll come back and glue the other side later. Once that's done, let's flip our model back over. Following our symbol mapping, let's drop our first foam cross member in place. Once it's in place, let's run a bead of glue up one side. We'll also run a bead of glue across where the foam meets the wood. Do the same thing here in the back. Glue one side, and I'm going to run a bead of glue where the foam meets the wood. Once that's done, we're going to drop our last wooden cross member in place. And just like before, we're just going to run one bead of glue. Once this is done, we need to sight down our model. What we need to do is we need to make sure that this wooden cross member is parallel with this wooden plate. We might have to adjust up or down on either side. Once we get it sighted correctly, we're going to run a bead of glue here, and we're going to hold it in place while the glue cools. That'll eliminate all twisting within our model. So I'm happy with the way this looks. I'm applying a slight amount of pressure to keep it perfect. I'm going to run a bead of glue right here. And I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. The whole time the glue's cooling, I'm looking down to ensure that everything is staying parallel. Once the glue's cooled, go ahead and add glue anywhere else the wood is making contact with the foam. As that's setting up, go ahead and look down it again to make sure that everything is parallel to one another. Located in your kit is this rectangle. We're going to be putting it in the long way. You're going to know it's correct when it fits exactly between this wooden plate and this wooden plate. What we're going to do is we're going to first position it between these two plates, and we're going to line the edge up flush with this edge down here. We're going to begin by putting a little bit of glue here, a little bit of glue here, checking to make sure we're flush, and I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Once that's done, we're going to be running a bead of glue right along the edge here. We're going to gently lift up the intake until it makes contact with that edge. Test if it looks good. I'll hold that in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. Once that's done, I'll do the same thing on the other side. As I'm looking at things from the top, I can measure and see that I'm at 2 inches here and I'm at 1.5 inches here. Somewhere along the way, things got a little twisted. That's no big deal. This plate will really be helpful when it comes to straightening things out. You can simply grab up here on the wood and we can push the nose section over 1/4 inch. What we'll do is we'll apply a bead of glue right along the top of this former where it meets the plate. Press that over 1/4 inch, and I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Next, I want to run a little bit of glue between the fuselage and this plate. Just let gravity do all the work. Doesn't have to go all the way down. Once that's done, we're going to drop on our top piece. I'm going to eyeball this and center it left and right. I want to make sure that this skin is even with this skin, and I want to center it up in the back. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue along the edge, along the formers. And we're going to drop it back in place, starting here at the front, making sure it's flush and centered, and then going to the back. Apply downward pressure until the glue's had a chance to cool. I really want to make sure, pressing down here at the front especially. Notice that my hand is directly above former. If you press between the formers, you're going to end up with a crinkle. Once that's had a chance to cool, run a bead of glue right where the skin meets the plate. Go ahead and remove these two parts from your kit. Let's begin by removing paper where indicated. Add a bevel. And we'll do the same on the other side. And remove paper from one side here. And we're going to be dropping this right inside of these brackets. We'll let that cool for a minute, and we're going to test fit it onto our airframe. To do our test fit, we're going to be sliding this plate between this former and this former. The paper from this and this is going to be shingling over the paper here and here. I'm going to press down just slightly, and I want to push it in until these ears drop down here and here. Once that's done, I'm going to gently press this down, and our fit looks really good right there. Now that I've got my plate in place, using a razor blade, I'm going to score the nacelle. This will be a little bit difficult to show. I'm going to be running a bead of glue just under that score line. Once I got my glue in place, drop that up between those formers till my tabs drop down, and I'm going to press straight down and hold in place until the glue cools. Looks like it popped up right here. I'm going to run a piece of tape right along the edge. I'll run a second piece of tape right up on the edge. Run a bead of glue just underneath, press down, and I'm going to pull my tape up, which will pull away all that excess glue. Once the glue is cooled, I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to push it over to close this seam. Next, I'm going to run a bead of glue just underneath. I'm going to push it over and push it down. And I'm going to hold that in place while the glue cools. Once the glue cools, I'll do the same thing on the other side. Once you have both sides glued in place, go ahead and remove the paper from C11. Once you've removed the paper, go ahead and add shape. Next, we're going to add a bevel. Once we've added our bevel, we're going to do a quick test fit. You'll notice that whenever you squeeze a part, you can drop it down there below the paper line, and when the part relaxes, it'll flatten out and go where it needs to be. You can see that it's popping out here. Looks like we added a little bit too much shape, so I'm going to flatten this out just a bit, and we're going to drop it in again. All right, that looks good. We're going to pull it out one more time and add some glue. To glue it in place, we're going to run a bead of glue right here and here, and glue right across the top. Drop that edge right underneath the paper and do the same on this side. Now is a really good time to do the radio programming. As you do the programming, you'll be able to check to make sure that there's no binding in the mechanism. It can be done later, but I prefer to do it now.
In this part of the video, I'm going to show you how to hook up your F14 to your transmitter. Now the F14 here is already set up, but I'm going to show you how I did it. I'm not going to be going over the transmitter basics, such as creating a model and adding new inputs. As stated before, this plane is not for beginners. So there is an expectation that you know your transmitter decently before attempting this build. First, I'll show you all of my receiver connections, and then I'll show you how I hooked it up on my transmitter. Another note, I'm using an OpenTX Radio Master. This is very similar to any FrSky product. For any Spectrum users out there, I'm not entirely sure if you can do this. I don't have much Spectrum experience. What I can tell you is this requires 7 channels minimum for a receiver, and my mixing includes temporary elevons, temporary ailerons, differential thrust, and 2 moving sweep wings. So just keep that in mind if you're a Spectrum user. You might need to invest in a different transmitter. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so for this build, we're going to be using the FrSky X8R. With the Radio Master, you can use almost any 8 channel or above, but we have a bunch of these laying around, so we're going to use this one. Channel 1 is one of the throttle cables. In channel number 2, we have the starboard elevator. In channel number 3, we have the port side elevator. Channel number 4 is empty. I'm using that as a rudder mix for a differential thrust. For channel 5, I have the port side swing wing mechanism servo. And for channel 6, I have the starboard swing wing mechanism servo. Channel 7 is the main wing ailerons wide together. And finally, channel 8 is your second throttle. On top of this, make sure your ESCs are wide together into one power cable, so we're giving power to both ESCs whenever we're hooking this up. Let's go ahead and dive right into the transmitter. As previously mentioned, I'm going to be using a Radio Master today, and again, this video won't be going over any of the basic transmitter setups. This plane is not for beginners, so you need to have some previous transmitter and flying experience before building this plane. Now, I'm in the inputs page right now, and you can see there are a lot of things to do. If you use all the equipment recommended for this build, this should be almost a copy and paste for you watching this video, but I will go into depth about what I did. You want to make sure and have expo on your ailerons, elevators, and your rudder / differential thrust. And I forgot to mention, you can add rudders to this plane, but the one that I'm setting up today does not have any, so I won't be showing you how to, but it's very easy. You set it up just like any other 4-channel aircraft. We didn't do it on this build because we only have 8-channel receivers, and also it's just unnecessary weight in my opinion. But as far as expo goes, I think 30% does it. It really helps when flying in the swept back position. It makes flying smooth a whole lot easier. Now for our sweep wing mechanism, you can see I'm still on the inputs page, and channel 5 and 6 are dedicated to switch SF. And that's my switch right here. So if you see when I hit this switch, the wings will go back and vice versa. I'll hop into one of these so I can show you what I did. Okay, so the only thing that I really did in here was just change the source, and by default it's just 3 little lines. You just click on it and select whatever switch you want to use. Super easy. You'll want to do this for both channels 5 and 6. You can set all of this up on a 3-position switch with a midway point of the sweep wing mechanism, but on this tune I'll only be doing 2. If one of your sweep wing mechanism servos is backwards, simply navigate to the output page and switch the direction. But mine's correct, so I'm going to go ahead and change it back. Another really important part is setting your endpoints for these servos. If one is set too far, you're putting a lot of strain on the servo and also the wood, and you risk burning your servo up. In the swept forward position, there's a stop built in, so simply adjust the output point until the servo hits the stop. Now for the backward position, we want to line the main wing up with the rear elevator. And you can eyeball this, but we want to get it as close as possible. Also, if you notice on the main plate of wood, there are lines scored into the wood to help you set the correct range of motion on your wings. These help tremendously. There's one more thing we need to do on our sweep wings. We need to set a delay. So on our mixes page, let's go to channel 5. And if you see over here, we have delay up, delay down, slow up, and slow down. And you can see that I have these set to 2.1. Now this is going to vary from radio to radio, and it's also going to depend on personal preference. For a more scale sweep wing mechanism, I like to set mine at about 2 to 2.5. That makes a plane seem a lot more realistic in the air while also not being too slow. Now if I go back to channel 6, you see that I have a little different situation here. Because these servos are independently hooked up, there may be variance due to manufacturing or any drag that might be in this wing-wing mechanism. So in this case, my starboard side was a little bit slower to start, but also a lot faster to move. And so you have to play around with this a little bit just to get it really close. It doesn't have to be exact, but it looks a lot better when the wings go out the exact same time in the air. Now that our sweep wings are done, let's go ahead and talk about the temporary ailerons on the main wing. Super easy to set up. So I'm here in the inputs page, and I plugged my main ailerons into channel 7. So as you can see here, I have 30% expo and I have 100% rates. And you also see that I have my SF switch hooked up here. So I'm going to edit this really quick. And you can see I have 30% expo, and you can see I have my switch set to SF up. Now this is critical. If this is set to the rear position, you're going to have a lot of binding in the rear position, and you're going to have 0 ailerons in the forward position. So make sure that this is set to the forward position. Now I'll briefly go over my elevon setup. So I'm in the inputs page, and you can see that I have the aileron on channel 2, the elevator in channel 3, and I've gone in here and I've inserted after a second channel. So it's a little weird, but it works. If I go over to the mixes page, this looks a little different. So there's a lot of switch things going on around here. And I inserted after 2 elevator inputs, both of them being negative 100%. And then on channel 3, I have another negative aileron, but on my insert afters, I have 2 positive 100%. And I'll explain this a little more. So this mix right here is the channel itself and 1 insert after, 1 being an aileron, 1 being an elevator. And as you can see, when the switch is down, which is the swept backward position, I have 1 channel acting as an aileron and an elevator at the same time. But if I go down 1 further, I have another insert after, that's another elevator, but this one is set to the up position. So whenever the switch is down and the sweep wings are in the back position, the rear elevator acts as an aileron and an elevator while the main wing ailerons are disabled. But when the wings go forward, the elevons turn into a regular elevator. And the same thing for channel 3. The only difference is these 2 are not negative. That's because the servo is mounted in a different position and needs to be reversed. And this may vary a little bit kit to kit, but this is the basic setup for your elevons and elevator. And one thing to note, if you need to do any sub-trimming, do this in the Outputs tab. Don't use your trims readily available. Those are for Flite only. And I find it much easier doing it in the Outputs tab rather than the Inputs or Mixes. Once this is done, we can go ahead and set up our differential thrust. This is a breeze. So here in Inputs, channel 1 is throttle, and if I scroll down, channel 8 is throttle as well. When I go to Mixes, you see that I have done insert after. And then I went in and I changed my source to rudder. And then I also changed the weight to negative 100%. I'll go back, and on channel 8, I've done the same thing, but this one is a 100% rudder and not negative 100%. After you get this done, test to see which one is spooling up. If you push the stick to the left, you should have the right motor spool up. And if you push the motor to the right, you should have the left motor spool up. If your differential thrust is backwards, simply switch channel 1 and 8 and it'll be fixed. Also on your inputs page, make sure on channel number 4, which remember we don't have anything plugged into on our receiver, it is strictly for differential thrust. Make sure it has 30% expo or whatever your desired expo number is. And also while your plane is in this state, go ahead and do a ESC calibration. To do that, make sure your transmitter is on and your plane is off and unplugged. you want to set your throttle to 100% and then plug your battery in. ESCs will chime a couple times and then back your throttle all the way down to 0% quickly. You'll hear a few more chimes and then your ESCs are calibrated, and so they'll spool at the exact same time at the exact same rate. Let's go ahead and do a check of the entire aircraft. I realize the explanation I gave to tune this plane was rather brief, but again, I'm going to keep repeating this. This plane is not for beginners. You must have extensive radio knowledge to be able to tune and fly this plane. This is the Master Series for a reason. Now let me go through all my controls. With the wings swept forward, I should have my 2 ailerons on the main wing working, and the rear elevators should only be elevators at this point. Okay, so that is perfect. And I left all of my rates at 100%. You can turn them down if you want a more docile flight, but I like doing a lot of acrobatics, so I'm going to leave mine very high. I'll go ahead and check my differential. When I push the left stick to the left, my starboard motor should spool. And I know you can't see it, but it is turning, so we're good. And I'll check the other one. Okay, we're good. And now let's go ahead and check our swing wing mechanism to make sure they go at the same time or very close to, and they end up in the right spots. Okay, so that's really close. That'll be good. Now right here, my wings are lined up perfectly. And whenever I take them back, they line up with the lines that are etched onto the wood, indicating that we tuned it right. Now, whenever the wings are back, we need to make sure that our main wing ailerons are disabled and our rear elevators become elevons. Okay, so that's perfect. And also while we're here, whenever I do a left turn, I want to make sure that my port side elevator goes up and my starboard elevator goes down. So that looks good. I'll check it going the other way. Perfect. I'll go up, then I'll go down. This thing looks like it's ready to fly. A couple other notes really quick. Go ahead and set all of the control surfaces to the neutral position, and the rear elevators can be set flat. They will need very little adjusting if your CG is correct. And with that, the tuning is done, and we can get back to the build.
Once you've got the wiring done, go ahead and flip your aircraft upside down, and we're going to add the landing gear housing. If you decide to add a landing gear, this is a great place to tie it into. You just need to make sure that whenever you punch all the way through, that it doesn't make contact with this wooden plate. The landing gear housing consists of 3 parts. We are only going to be installing 2 at this time. So what we're going to do is we're going to locate these 2 pieces from our kit, and I'm going to remove the paper here and here. I'm going to take it, I'm going to bend it over, and I'm going to add a bevel along this edge. I'll also do a slight bevel on this edge. Once that's done, I'm going to do a quick test fit. Now what I'm looking at is it's easy enough to line it up here in the back. It's going to line these 2 corners up. Here at the front, you're going to notice a very small reference mark. I'm going to put that corner right up against that reference mark, and using a razor blade, I'm going to run it right along the edge. All right, once that's done, I'm going to run a bead right along the former, and then I'm going to run a bead right underneath the line we created. I'm going to start in the back, line up my corners, and then I'm going to line up the front corner to the reference mark. Once that's all lined up, I'm going to push it against the former on the sides. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, you'll notice that the edge is lined up just inside this reference mark. If we go up here towards the front, I'm going to push this in until that reference mark is exposed. Once that's done, I'm going to run a bead of glue right where the foam meets the wood. Hold that in place for a couple minutes while the glue cools, then we're going to do our next part the same way. Just like on the previous part, I'm going to remove paper here and here, fold it over, add a bevel here, and a bevel here. Once that's done, I'm going to line up the corner there at the back. This will be an edge-to-edge fit, and I'm going to locate my reference mark up here at the front. It's a little bit harder to see. Once we get everything in position, we're going to scratch a line across just like we did on the previous part. Once we have our line, I'm going to run a bead of glue just underneath it, and I'm going to add a bead of glue along the edge. Drop it in place and hold it for a full 2 minutes before moving on. Once that's done, go ahead and add a bead of glue where the foam meets the wood. Once that's had a chance to cool down, do the same thing on the other side. Once both landing gear housings are in place, let's go ahead and install this bottom piece right here. We're going to start by removing the paper. We'll add bevels to the 2 areas indicated. Once we've added our bevels, we're going to do a test fit. We're going to be lining up this edge to this edge. Once we get the leading edge lined up, we're just going to press straight down. At the back, we want to make sure that the edges line up pretty close. We can always do a little bit of trimming. I'm going to take a ruler and push straight down. This gives me even pressure. If I just use my fingertips, it might be slightly wavy. And about here and here, we have a couple wooden cross members that we're going to press against. All right, once that's in place, I'm going to lift up the front end. I'm going to shoot a little bit of glue underneath the lip, right along that former. And I'm going to press and hold. Once that's done, I'm going to be running a bead of glue right along the edge from here all the way back. I'll do that on both sides. I didn't add glue right underneath this dashed line. We're actually going to be cutting this away here in just a minute. Once that's had a chance to cool down, using a razor blade, go ahead and connect the dots here at the top, and then we're going to make a second cut right here. You can see I'm going in at about a 45-degree angle. That'll help that part come out a little better. These holes will give us a little bit better airflow to our EDFs. So here at the back, I'm going to glue these 2 edges together. So I'm going to have a little bit of tape on standby. Add a quick bead of glue. I'll run my piece of tape and bring the 2 edges together. You can see that I've got a little bit of an edge sticking out here. Using a razor blade, you can trim away the excess so the edges match up to one another. And you can add a little bit of glue if you like. That'll get it. Once that's done, let's flip our assembly over and we are going to add the wing housings. To do our wing housing, let's first run a bead of glue right along here. These have been cracked open so that we're able to ship them. So let's go ahead and glue those 2 edges together. We'll hold it in place for a few seconds, then we're going to remove paper. When removing paper, I'm going to remove paper off the entire area except for right here. This one, you can do it if you feel like it. It really doesn't make any difference. Once we've got all the paper removed, we're going to be adding a little bit of shape anywhere that you see the scores. I'm going to begin by adding a lot of shape from here to here. I'm going to flip my assembly over, line up this point with the edge of the table. I want to make sure that I don't have any glue build up here on top of the table. Once I make sure all the glue's removed, I'm going to gently fold this all the way over on itself. Notice that I'm using the palm of my hand, wrist, and forearm. I want to make sure I'm bending this edge over and keeping it as flat as possible. If you're just bending it from a couple different places, you're likely to get crinkles. All right, now that we've got shape added here, I'm going to add a little bit of shape in this area right here. I'm going to line up this point here, and this hand is going to stay planted, and I'm going to pivot whole assembly, pulling it off the edge of the table with my right hand. All right, once that's done, we're going to add some shape in this area right here. To do that, you're going to have to find the corner of a table and do the same thing. Once that's done, we need to add shape here. Again, I'm going to the corner of the table and just adding shape where we've got the scores. So what you're going to see is we've got this flat plate that curves down here at this angle, curves down here at this angle, and curves around at this angle. There's a lot going on with this part, and I think you'll really appreciate the scores that we put underneath. It'll really help capture the shape we're looking for. Once that's done, we need to add shape right along these scores. In order to do that, I'm going to line those scores up with the edge of the table, and we're just going to gently bend the edge over. I'm also going to add a bevel along this edge. I've discovered it just fits a little bit better when I add a small bevel. Once that's done, I'm going to add a bead of glue about 3/4 of an inch long up here at the front. I'm going to bring these two edges together, and I'm going to allow the glue to cool for a full 2.5 minutes. Once that's done, we're going to lay our assembly on the table. What I want to do is I want to push straight down right here. And I want to make sure that this entire line is right up against the table's edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm next going to add a bead of glue right along this line. What I'm trying to do is create a small step. You'll notice that when I push down here in the middle, we've got a nice gentle curve being created. When we flip the assembly upside down, what we're doing is we're creating a small step. And this is a neat detail, and it's really easy to do. What I'm going to do, I'm going to flip this back over, push down, and then I'm going to add a bead of glue right along this edge. And you notice that my glue isn't covering entirely. That's okay, we'll go back and hit it a couple more times. Let that cool for a couple minutes, then go ahead and add a second bead. You can also run a real thin bead of glue here on this side. Once glue cools down, we're going to test fit our housing onto our aircraft. Up here at the front, you're going to see a little stair step. I want this stair step even with the leading edge of the intake. So that's going to be the first point that we line up. Next, we're going to push the housing up against this center section of fuselage. And I'm gently pressing down in the back. If you look at the gap between the fuselage and the housing at the front, you'll see that I've got an opening a little less than a 1/16. I've got the same thing in the back. When that happens, we're going to do a little bit of trimming. So, whenever we do trimming, we're going to be removing the material that is currently making contact with the fuselage. So if I look, it looks like I'm making contact here and I'm making contact here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out just a little bit and I'm going to run my razor blade and remove a little bit of material. The amount of material that I'm going to be removing is going to be the same as the gap right here. Let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to line it up at the front first, make sure that step is lined up with the end of the intake, and I'm going to gently press this up against the fuselage. All right, that looks a lot better. I will be adding a bead of glue when everything is finalized, so if there is a little bit of a gap, that's okay. In order to make sure that our wings move in and out smoothly, it may be necessary to squeeze this bottom layer of foam. What I'm doing is I'm kind of adding a little bit of a bevel of sorts by crushing the foam. And so whenever this thing opens and closes, it's not making contact with this little step. If your wing is up kind of high in the back, you might run a razor blade where the upper wing skin and the lower wing skin come together. We want to make sure this is down as far as possible. While we can compensate, show you this piece here, while we can compensate for this sticking up by bending this down more, I find it better just to get this as flat as you possibly can before adding the housing. And you can always, if you go ahead and you cut the upper and lower wing skin apart, once we have the housing in place, you can go ahead and add a bead of glue back to bring the two edges together. I am happy with the fit. I do need to add some spacers before we glue our housing in place. Locate the HS1 through HS3 spacers from your kit. Follow the symbol mapping instructions and stack them together. Once you've got them stacked, we're going to drop them in the corresponding slot indicated by the symbol mapping. Notice that the high side is towards the outside of the aircraft. All right, once that's done, let's get our wing housing glued in place. Whenever I'm adding my housing, I want to make sure I've got a nice straight line from the front of the aircraft to the back of the aircraft. Okay, that looks good. Once that's done, I'm going to run a very heavy bead of glue on top of these spacers. I'm going to run a bead of glue just underneath the line that I created. Make sure my wire's out of the way, and I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue right here on top of the spar. I'm going to line up this step here at the front, slide this up against the fuselage, and I'm going to be pressing down. You can see how I've got my hands opened up wide. I want to make sure I'm applying downward pressure above the spacers inside the housing. So here at the back, it's come loose a little bit. I want to make sure that here at the back, this is laid down as much as possible. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure it's flat against the wing. I'm pushing down, and I'm also pushing over. Run a bead of glue right there and press and hold. Any excess, I'm going to wipe away using some scrap. Using the back side of your razor blade, run it down this score right here. We're going to break this open. I'm going to add a bevel right here. I'm also going to add a bevel right here. My blade is following the one score. I'm going to flip it around and create another bevel. And we'll be creating a little double bevel here where we can fold this over. This is actually the third piece of our landing gear housing. Whenever we fold this up, we'll have a nice straight line all the way down. All right, once we've got the bevels cut, what I want to do is I want to place my hand flat on the housing, and I'm going to apply just a little bit of pressure. I'm putting pressure directly below this spacer. I'm going to draw the piece around, and I'm going to fold it over to where it makes contact. I might have to take a little bit of pressure off so that it gently drops down and lines up. Now, if we look up here, you're going to see that this piece is too long, and that's by design. We have a lot of pieces that come together, and I want to make sure that the fit between this part and this part is as close as we can get. So by cutting it long, I can look at it from the top, and I can see how much material that I need to remove. So now when I bring this down, I'll be able to fold this up, and we might have to trim a little bit off at the top, and that's okay. I just want to make sure that our length is now correct. So now that we've got our rough fit in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my hand underneath that spacer, and I'm going to draw it towards me. I'm going to apply a little bit of glue between the housing and the spacer. I do want to make sure that it's glued in place there on the top. I'm going to hold this for a couple minutes while the glue cools, then we're going to bring it around and we're going to glue this piece to our wood. Once that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue along the wood near the edge of the foam. Bring this around. I want to line these two edges up, and I want to bring this straight down. During your test fit, if you notice that you've got a little bit of a gap on either end, you can remove some material as needed. Once that's cooled down, you can see where I've got my edges lined up and I've got a straight line. I'm going to create a scratch. I'm applying pressure outwards from the inside of the intake, and that'll bring those two edges together. I'm going to fold my part back, and I'm going to run a bead of glue right underneath that scratch I just made. A little glue here and here. And I'm going to fold this down. Next, I'm going to add a bead of glue between the intake and the housing here at the front. You can see that I'm gently squeezing the intake. I'm trying to move it towards the outside just a little bit. I'm noticing here on this model that I've got more of a gap than I like. This has happened a couple times. What I might do for a production run is add a little bit of extra material here. If the material looks excessive, you can always cut a little bit away. Once that's done, you can run a small bead of glue between the landing gear housing and your wing housing. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, do the same thing on the other side. It's a good idea to add tape to the underside of the nacelle. Pay attention to where the nacelles are making contact with the table. I generally like to run tape from the lower leading edge of the intake all the way past where the nacelle is making contact with the table. I like running 2 to 3 layers of tape. Other potential options will include glassing the underside of the nacelles. I'm also experimenting with adding some 3D plates on the underside to act as skids. These plates will be free downloads offered on the Flite Test website. Once your housing's been glued in place, we're going to add 4 vanes to the top of the aircraft. If you look at these vanes, one side is slightly taller than the other. The tall side goes towards the nose of the aircraft. To install, I'm going to run a bead of glue along the bottom, and you're going to see a reference mark here and one here. And I'm going to drop this down right between the 2 marks. Hold that for about 30 seconds, then we're going to do one here, and then we're going to mirror the process on the other side. Next, let's pop this door open. You can see I've got a little bit of access to the servo arm. There's not really much you can do. In order to access the servo or to change anything on the servo arm, you will need to remove this wing housing. The wing housing and the nose for this aircraft are going to be available as free downloads. So if there's something that goes wrong, you will be able to fix it. Once I pop that open, I'm going to just close it, and I'm going to run a bead of glue right here. And I'm going to let that cool. You can see this just slightly open. Now that that's done, let's install our vertical stabilizers. To install our vertical stabilizers, we're simply going to drop this tab down into the slot. All right, our test fit looks good. I'm going to add 2 heavy beads of glue. These 2 beads are going to go inside the undercut, and I'm going to add glue down inside this cutaway. Once that's done, I'm going to drop this in place. And I'm going to run a quick bead of glue where the vertical stabilizer meets the exhaust. The vertical stabilizers do not go vertical. They are tilted just slightly towards the outside of the aircraft. Do the same thing on the other side. The last two pieces we're going to attach to our aircraft are these stabilizers. Stabilizers make a really big difference, especially in Delta flight. Now, on the real aircraft, these hang directly off the bottom. We're going to have to cheat a little bit since these are belly landers. If you look closely, there's going to be a small reference mark here, and there's going to be a small reference mark back here. What we're going to do is we're going to line up either end of our stabilizer, and I'm going to rotate it down until it makes contact with the table, and I'm going to bring it back up just slightly. So when the aircraft lands, the stabilizers should never make contact with the ground. If you need to remove a little bit of material so that the edge fits flush to the underside, do that now. Once the glue's had a chance to cool, you can run another bead of glue between the stabilizer and the nacelle. Then repeat the process on the other side. I'm noticing when I close this wing that it's really digging in right here. Well, just like we did on the other side, I'm going to mash the underside of that foam, kind of thin down this portion of the wing as it goes into the wing housing. Once we get it the way we want, we can always run a bead of glue up under here if you haven't already done that. It's still making contact, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my hand flat. I'm going to kind of push it towards the center. We're not getting a whole lot of movement, but we are getting a little. What we want to do is we want to open this up just a little bit more here on the inside. Again, I'm laying my hand flat, kind of pushing it towards the middle. What that's doing is it's making the foam buckle right there, which is giving us a little bit more room. Sometimes our housing just needs to be held in place for a while. This allows the foam to take a set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a piece of tape here, place my hand flat, and I'm going to slide it over just a little bit. And I can't even really feel any movement, but I do know that I am having an effect. I'm going to stretch the tape tight over here on this side, and what that's going to do is that's causing the foam to kind of buckle right here where we want it. And that buckling creates a little bit of a high spot that allows those wings to hide in there a little bit better. The shaping we're doing at this point is very, very subtle. So I'm looking at my housing right here, and I notice it's kind of high. So again, we're going to add a little bit of subtle shape. We're going to lay a piece of tape across here, and I'm going to pull this tape tight where it's kind of under tension. And I can do the same thing on the other side. What we're doing is we're just training the foam to do what we want. Again, most people won't even worry about this, but if you really like that to lay down, you can do it. You can also put a little bit of weight on top. Eventually, the foam is going to stay just where you put it. The last thing we need to do is slide the nose in place. Our aircraft is done. Let's go do some flying.